Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from Mr. David Brown, formerly of the London Fire Brigade. So if Mr. Brown is there, perhaps you'd ask him to come in, please. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Brown. Yes, please sit down and make yourself comfortable. Right, ready to carry on, I hope?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Kinnear, when you're ready.
Thanks, sir. Good morning, Mr. Brown.
Good morning.
When we broke on Thursday afternoon, we were going to turn to the question of record keeping, and that's the topic I'd like to start to discuss with you today.
Okay.
Now, could we first turn to HOM quadruple 01124/31. Now, this is an extract from the LACNOR control report, which was published in November 2012. And we see in the bottom third of the page, under the heading E7, a heading conclusion about control officer training and knowledge. And at paragraph 167, it says this: an incomplete database record of training provided by the LFB to the control officers exists covering the period from 1981 to 2011. This record includes initial, continuation and refresher training given to control officers. Were you aware of that conclusion at the time?
I was.
Now, could we, bearing in mind that conclusion, could we turn back to PN 164, and in particular the version that was current in 2009, so at the time of the LACNOR fire, which we find at LFB 000-84054, if we turn to page 3 within it. Thank you. Now, here we see, and if we can look at paragraph 2.5, under the heading Watch Training Record, it says this: a record of all training and instruction carried out is to be maintained by each watch manager. Now, given the poor record keeping that had been identified by the control report, what did you do to ensure that record keeping at control satisfied the obligation set out here in paragraph 2.5 of PN 164?
So there were discussions with, so 2011 would have been prior to when Richard Chandler joined. So there were discussions with Scott and his team at the time in terms of the issues that we'd found at LACNOR and what we already had. So Excel spreadsheets was effectively what was kept. And just reminding Scott and his team of the need to make sure that these Excel spreadsheets were kept up to date. And so there's the issue of forward planning, and then there's the issue of recording, which, whilst we can deal with in a holistic manner, are actually two separate issues. And so I was as interested in the forward planning as I was in the recording of information.
Now, mindful of that, when you received the control report in November 2012, did you ask to inspect the training records that applied to control to see that control training was being properly and effectively carried out?
No, I didn't, but I did ask Scott to go through them and to assure me that him and his team were satisfied that they were being carried out appropriately.
Now, could we go to LFB 000-55203/7? Now, this is an extract from Station Manager Kelly's audit from August 2010, so slightly more than 2 years before the LACNOR control report. And we can see then, again, the bottom third of the page, the subheading Planning of Training. And below that, if we can look at paragraphs 49 and 50. 49 says this: notwithstanding the above, it is vitally important that adequate training planning systems are implemented for all courses, including appropriate training records that support the cyclical training planning process. And paragraph 50, under the emboldened heading, says this: implement adequate training planning and recording systems. Now, would you agree that it's clear that you were aware, at least in August 2010, that a system was required adequately to record training in control?
Yes.
Was the remedial measure that you took at the time, or was taken at your instigation, to bring control training in line with station training and use the STEP system for that purpose?
It was, but it was still some time after this before STEP was fully integrated in control in the same way as it was at stations.
And was it expected, at least initially that control training would be as automated as station-based training in due course?
That was certainly a long-term plan, yes.
Now, if we can turn to LFB 00106101, we see here that on the 15th of January 2013, so 2 months or so after the LACNOR control report, Scott Hayward sent you what he describes as a detailed training audit summary as directed. Now we can go to that summary, which we can find at LFB 00106102/1. Now here we can see that the document sets out or purports to set out progress made as against Station Manager Kelly's recommendations back in the summer of 2010. Can you help us? Why had you asked Scott Hayward to provide this update?
Well, this was as a result of the regular meetings I had with Scott, and we'd been discussing it at a meeting, and there was obviously a lot of information, so I asked him to put it in writing to me so I could review it and then discuss it with him further at future meetings.
Were you mindful that the LACNOR inquests were coming up soon?
Well, yes, that too, yes, but that it wasn't. This wasn't done in order just to satisfy the issues that were going to arise from the inquest. This was as much to do with the normal day-to-day management I was having over control.
And you were aware these were against Station Manager Kelly's recommendations, and we'd seen what he said in respect of training. You'd had the LACNOR control report, and it had obviously made conclusions in relation to training. Was your request for an update therefore prompted by the fact that little, if any, effective progress had been made in relation to the maintenance of adequate records of training?
Yeah, I think at one of our meetings I discussed the issue with Scott, and I wasn't satisfied, so I wanted a more detailed breakdown of exactly what was going on.
Could we turn over the page 2, and look at paragraph 6, please? And we see there the recommendation to implement adequate training, planning and recording systems. And the update says this in red text. There is a control-owned spreadsheet detailing trainer-led or external training courses for all staff. This database has been transferred onto the STEP database. However, it is still a requirement to manually update STEP as staff complete courses. We are still working with IT to enable our training to be automatically updated onto STEP when the course has been completed. Now, can you help us as to why some 2.5 years after the decision to move to recording on STEP, it's still been updated manually?
Yes, this was a source of disappointment to all of us. It just basically breaks down, from what I can recall, to interface issues between STEP and the staff attendance recording system in control and the shift system in control, because there were short shifts, late shifts, early shifts, long shifts, and it was my understanding it was difficult to be able to map them all together. So the issue, the compromise, was that control would send the information to information management, who would load it up. Sometime shortly after this, control actually got access to STEP, so they could load it up themselves, and then sometime later it became automated, so it was a painfully slow and gradual process.
Now, your understanding appears to be, therefore, that the block to implementation was technical rather than anything else. Is that a fair summary? It
certainly was technical, and I intervened and spoke to people to try to hurry it along to assist the management in control. I think also there could have been more pushing from control side of things. I think there was a combination of issues, but certainly IT blockages were a big issue for us.
One thing that Scott Hayward said in his evidence was that the glacial progress was due to, quotes, competing priorities rather than any particular technical problem. And he explained that STEP took its information from STARS, and that an operational change to STARS took priority over the control elements of STARS. And for that reason, manual inputting remained the case. Were you aware of that particular problem at the time?
There certainly were constant upgrades to STARS. It isn't. I don't think it's true that operational updates routinely trumped control updates. Certainly, operational updates were very important, but it dependent on the merit of what the update contained. So certainly there were competing priorities. That is absolutely true. Yes.
Were you mindful of a tendency to downgrade, or put differently, place insufficient weight on priorities for control training as opposed to, for example, operational training?
No, I don't think that's necessarily the case. But as I've just said, in terms of being more proactive and pushing it from control, as I think we spoke about on Thursday, in terms of the control not being an obvious and ever-present system within headquarters it used to be. I think those two issues probably made it even more difficult for control to make their case, as it were.
Now, could we go back to the replies you gave on the 16th of January 2013 to various questions that Rita Dexter had posed to you in relation to the Lindridge review? And if we could go to LFB 000-858-54/15. Thank you. And we see here action reference 16 is in the centre of the screen. And the bottom paragraph of the review process findings box is entitled Training Records. And it says this: currently, all training at control is recorded on a spreadsheet at control and transferred to STEP by the Information Management Department. Now, in the corresponding comment, Rita Dexter asked this: and there is some evidence or verification that this has ever happened? And you replied, excuse me, I'm assured it has all been transferred from the spreadsheet to STEP. I have randomly checked one from each watch to confirm. A manual system exists for future training. Work is progressing well to get it automated. Now, first of all, what had you checked from each watch in order to provide this assurance to the Deputy Commissioner?
That a spreadsheet existed. So when you and I spoke on Thursday and I explained that I'd visit control roughly monthly, I tried to spend at least an afternoon or a morning, or ideally all day there, and do a range of different things, particularly discussing with staff in the control room. And I'll take the opportunity to talk to the trainers who were also in the control room virtually all the time, and then took the opportunity just to look and see that these spreadsheets existed.
And was that spreadsheet on STEP at the time?
No, the spreadsheet will be kept separately and then would be sent to Information Management, who uploaded it onto STEP.
Can you remember now, what did the spreadsheet show in particular?
I think the spreadsheet showed names on each watch and the type of training that would have been carried out and the dates on which that training was conducted.
And you say you went to control monthly. On each of those occasions, did you check this spreadsheet to see whether records were being kept properly and fully?
No.
Can you help us as to why not? The reason I ask, Mr. Brown, is obviously you had Station Manager Kelly's views, you had the LACNOC control report. Progress is clearly slow, put politely. Why didn't you check the spreadsheet?
Well, if I can just briefly just give some background to control. So control was a group of staff of approximately 100, so it matched a very large fire station. The difference between the two was a fire station had one station manager managing it. Control had a principal operations manager, two senior operations managers, and a station manager. A fire station had 4 watches with a station officer in charge of each watch. Control had 6 operations managers, 2 of which would be on duty at the same time at a certain part of the day. A fire station had between about 8 and 12 crew managers. Control had 22 assistant operational managers. They had their own training team, they had their own technical support group, their own security, their own engineers. That they were the most highly managed group of staff that I managed. So my view was the last thing they need is someone else looking at the same records. They've got a competent management team to do it. It's my job to make sure the systems are in place and to support them in doing it. So that's the reason why I wouldn't go into that level of detail. Plus the fact I wanted their management team to do it, and if I did it, that potentially gives an opportunity for others to say, well, there's no need for me to do it.
Could we go to an update that Sue Budden provided on the 11th of February 2015 to you and others about progress in relation to implementation of internal audit recommendations? We can find this at LFB 000-76158/2. There we go. We have the email that she sent there. It appears to relate to audit recommendations that were presented to the Corporate Management Board that morning. If we scroll up, we can see that Sue Budden was sent an updated version of the progress report on the 19th of February 2015. Now, if we can look at that updated report, which is at LFB 000-44640, we see on page 1 under the summary title, it says this: this report summarises the work carried out under the Internal Audit Shared Service Agreement by the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime, MOPAC, Directorate of Audit, Risk and Assurance, DARA, in the third quarter of 2014-15. Is it right, therefore, that MOPAC's Directorate of Audit, Risk and Assurance carried out internal audits for the LFB under the terms of an internal shared services agreement?
That's correct.
How often would control be audited by MOPAC?
It wasn't a regular programme. This was something that we discussed at our Corporate Management Board, and I seem to remember suggesting that it will be beneficial if control was included in the MOPAC audit.
Were you interviewed as part of the audit process, or was your role limited to instigating the audit?
I don't recall being interviewed. I think it was more about instigating the audit.
Now, if we can stay in this document but go to page 25, which hopefully is Annex B. Now we can see on the left-hand side, the far left-hand side, the first column refers to Brigade control, and it cites a final report dated February 2015. Now, I'm assuming that you read the final report. Is that a sound assumption?
Yes.
Would you have read this summary report before it was circulated to the CMB?
Yes.
Now, if we look at the second column from the left, it sets out areas of, quotes, effective control, close quotes. And then moving rightwards, the third column is entitled risk, recommendation and category. Is that right?
Yes.
And in the third column, it recorded the following risks. Paragraph 1, the training spreadsheet may be completed inaccurately or even altered intentionally, which could impact upon the ability of Brigade control to effectively monitor the provision of training. This could in turn result in the reporting of incorrect information to senior management. Paragraph 2, if the spreadsheet is not completed consistently and accurately, then the ability to monitor training levels may become difficult and inappropriate decisions may be made. Now, those particular risks appear to have been accorded a medium rating. Is that a correct reading?
Yes.
Did you discuss these two particular risks with Mr. Hayward?
Yes.
Did you discuss them with anyone else?
I would have most certainly discussed it with my line manager at the time when I had my regular meetings with her, just to update her what was happening. But in terms of progressing these, it would have been Scott.
In light of those discussions, why, in your view, by the time we get to February 2015, were there still significant problems with the recording of training at control?
Well, I think partly because we still hadn't moved on from sending the information to information management to upload. And it was soon after this, in fact, I seem to recall it was this that helped achieve controls access to STEP rather than send to information management. There was always the issue of what I would call centrally led training versus locally led training, which is a bit of an odd analogy for control because they're so analogous, but centrally led training is what will be delivered by the training team. Locally led training is what the operations managers would determine what was necessary for their own staff on their own watches. And it was that locally led training that I think was the weak point in this, in terms of not being recorded, which is why I always believe there was much more training that went on than was actually recorded.
By this stage, we're nearly a half decade on from Station Manager Kelly's audit, just under 3 years on from the LACNOR control report. Did it occur to you at the time that progress is not being made, we're not dealing with this issue, and what the root causes of such a glacial delay were?
Yes, absolutely. Those concerns, however, were coloured by the fact that there was a large amount of individual types of training going on, that there were individual plans for, and things were being recorded. And I think there was, it wasn't a year or so before this, I'd asked for some details of training records in terms of fire survival guidance training, and the information I got back was very encouraging. So that, combined with the fact that the operational support team did have a training plan for delivery, which isn't quite the same thing, and plus the rush to get vision trained and sorted, kind of took the emphasis and the focus away from the core issue that really needs to be resolved, I think.
Noting that, Mr. Brown, looking at paragraph 1 of the risk column and the conclusion where it says the problems could in turn result in the reporting of incorrect information to senior management, did that observation not give you, at the very least, pause for thought that what you were being told about the nature and extent of training may not be wholly reliable, put mildly?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I say, I'm pretty sure that this is what was the emphasis and the push to actually get the access to STEP, although it didn't achieve our ultimate game, not just yet, in terms of automating the process.
Can you help us? We see in the 4th column from the left responsibility and agreed action, and there's a number of actions set out there to make good the deficiency. How did you ensure that that quartet of actions was actually implemented?
Well, so the responsibility here was the senior operations manager, which I believe at the time was probably Vic Bagnall / Keith Diamond. I think they were the two. It may be Lindsay Turner, but she might have left by then. And whoever they were would have reported to Scott. So then I would have gone through Scott to make sure that he had a handle on what was going on. I wouldn't have gone straight to these senior operations managers.
Can we now turn to a separate document, which is LFB 000-32169/11. And this is Assistant Commissioner George's review of Brigade control that he carried out in July 2016, so 16 months or thereabouts after the MOPAC audit reported. And if we look at paragraph 47, and in particular the second line, he said this: the review has identified that maintenance of skills training is ad hoc, not planned in a robust manner, and often not recorded on individuals' training records, ITRs. Whilst there is a responsibility and onus on individuals to maintain their ITRs correctly by manually entering completed training, this is not often done, and staff are seldom instructed to do so by their managers. Now, if we could turn over the page and look at paragraph 49C, top of the page, we can see in the third line he recommended the following: all training must be recorded on an individual's ITR. The SOMs should work with colleagues from the Brigade's information management team to introduce an IT solution to this, similar to training diaries used by station staff. Now, looking at what the Assistant Commissioner has concluded there, is it fair to say that the risks identified by MOPAC 16 months previously had still not been addressed in relation to the recording of training?
they've not been fully addressed in the way that we wanted to. Since the gap between this report and the MOPAC reports had seen step access given to control, but still not the fully automated system. So they're on a journey, but it was still taking too long to get to the destination.
Well, you're on a journey. For working purposes, that journey started in August 2010 with Station Manager Kelly's report, and his recommendations in respect of record keeping hadn't been satisfactorily implemented by this stage either, had they?
What we did have, so for example, we was introducing training for Resource Management Centre and National Coordinating Centre, and I'd ask for attributes to be allocated to stars because we had small groups of staff within each watch trained specifically in these roles. So we wanted to make sure that these numbers of staff were always available, not on leave, etc. So that, for example, we got an automated solution straight away. So there were certain parts of things that were working to the same standard of what was happening at fire stations. It was the holistic approach to training in its entirety that was behind fire stations.
Would you accept that this recommendation here and its predecessor in the form of Station Managers, Kelly, had still not been fully or properly implemented by the time you retired in March 2017?
Yes.
Taking the step back now, would you accept that the recording of training was a chronic systemic problem that was never satisfactorily resolved whilst you were responsible for control?
It was, I would accept that it was, our challenge was to bring it in line with station-based approach to training and recording, and we didn't achieve that. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it was a chronic failure because I think that's massively overstating the issue. There were provisions to record training, there were provisions to plan training, and aspects of it were as good as station-based staff, but we'd achieved such a high bar with station-based approach to training recording that control wasn't up to that standard.
Could we move on to a separate but related topic, which is the monitoring of training? And to start, could we go to your first statement and paragraph 66, which can be found at LFB 000 321 66/21. Now there you say this. It was not my role to personally audit the control training records to ensure that FSG refresher training was taking place on a systemic basis or annually. I relied on the management structure and control, led by POM, Scott Hayward, to schedule and monitor the completion of FSG refresher training, which I tested at monthly management meetings. Were these monthly management meetings the one-to-ones which we discussed on Thursday?
Yes, but also at the Principal Management Board where we would quarterly discuss departmental plans and risk registers.
Would you be provided with written reports for these purposes of testing what was going on, or would you rely upon verbal assurances given by Scott Hayward, or a combination of the two?
It'll be a combination.
Did those meetings, the one-to-ones, routinely take place monthly?
Yes, I think we've established that on the odd occasion one would be cancelled, but it would be rescheduled. It certainly won't be the case that a monthly meeting would be missed.
And would that routine be kept even in, for example, Assistant Commissioner Chandler's absence?
Oh yes, when Richard left, then I re-established the meetings with Scott. Even for the period when Richard was on extended leave for about a 4-month period whilst he was in post, I then re-established the meetings with Scott. And if Scott wasn't available for a period, he was going to be on annual leave, then I would make sure I met with one of his SOMs.
And those monthly meetings, am I right in understanding you'd keep that routine even when Assistant Commissioners Chandler and George were in post?
Oh no, once they was in post, then the monthly meetings reverted to them. So I only met Scott when Richard Chandler or Tom George were not in post.
When you had your meetings with Scott Hayward, how frequently would training be a topic for discussion?
It would effectively be a standing item to discuss.
Now, Scott Hayward said in evidence that you didn't exercise much oversight in relation to training. What would be your response to that evidence?
I think what he's probably referring to is I didn't exercise much in terms of looking at specific records. But then my response to that would be, as I said earlier, training control was effectively the size of a large fire station. And the reason we had so much performance management on fire stations is because there was 102 of them. There was only one of control, and it was highly managed. So the reason I didn't go into that level of detail was because of those very reasons. So I think that's what Scott is probably referring to, not the overall interest in training.
Could we turn to LFB 00109092? Now, this is the version of the Kelly audit on which you commented in August 2010. And could we go to page 3 and paragraph 1? That could be expanded. We see in the second line that it says that the audit had been approved by the Training Management Board. What was that body?
Sorry, where is that?
Paragraph 1.
All right.
Second line.
I think the Training Management Board was a subset of the. This would have been prior to Babcock. So when there was a training department within the brigade, I think the Training Management Board was a strategic decision-making board within it. I don't believe I sat on that.
Can you remember now who did sit on it? If you can't remember.
I can't remember. I could have an educated guess, but I don't know for sure.
Can you remember now how frequently it met, if it was a strategic body?
If it was a strategic body, it would have met every 3 or 4 weeks.
Can you remember now what substantive role it played in the monitoring of training?
I seem to recall it was more about training delivery in terms of not delivery in so much as looking at how successful the delivery was, but about arranging delivery, looking at what courses needed to be delivered based on what information.
Could we go to page 9 and really look at the heading Quality Management and Assurance, if possible? And if we see at paragraph 63, Mr. Kelly said this: any overarching quality management plan should document how the quality of training is reviewed, maintained and managed. BCTS, presumably Brigade Control Training Services, does not have such a plan. And if we turn over the page to page 10 and look at the summary at paragraph 74, he said this: the development of a formal quality management plan would provide a robust framework to effectively manage all aspects of brigade control training. Now, while that was not part of his formal recommendation, did you consider implementing a quality management plan to ensure the robustness of control training?
Yes. First of all, I wanted to move from just a delivery plan to an overall holistic plan, as I've called it, and then we could move on to a quality management plan. I would add that there were, as I've said, there were aspects of this. So there was quality assurance processes in place, but they related to specific parts of the control, and there was assessment of the outcome of the training that went on at the end of the training course, and then the ongoing monitoring of the performance of control officers. So there were aspects of all of this. It just, without wishing to sound like a broken record, it was that they weren't all pulled together into one overall plan.
And whose responsibility was it to pull together the various strands?
Well, the responsibility sat with those immediately managing training. The overall accountability would have sat with the AC or myself.
Now, if we look at paragraph 75, Mr. Kelly says this: the call coach system is an effective tool for managing staff performance in terms of their response to emergency calls. Were you aware at the time that call coach was used to monitor and quality assure emergency calls?
Yes, I'd authorise the purchase of it.
Now, in her evidence, Jo Smith thought that an agreement had been reached before the Lacknell fire, that FSG calls would not be quality assured by call coach. Her recollection was that an agreement had been reached between DAC Payton, that's Payton, and representative bodies, like trade unions, on the Joint Committee for Control Staff. Now, do you remember any such agreement?
No, Alan Payton had been a long-standing Deputy Assistant Commissioner in charge of control, and he retired about 9 months after I took over the role of Assistant Commissioner.
In May 2009?
Yes, so he'd been in there for some considerable time, so if he had made such an arrangement, it would have been an arrangement that would have existed for some time. I wasn't aware of any such arrangement, if indeed it exists.
But you hadn't come across it during your time in charge?
No, I'm well aware of dealing with unions, that they are very acute to the idea of specific monitoring that could lead to disciplinary action for their members. So it doesn't surprise me that this would be discussed, but if it ever existed, I wasn't aware of it.
If they weren't being monitored by call coach, what was your understanding for what arrangements were in place to quality assure FSG calls?
Well, FSG calls, and I know from the best value review I carried out in the early 2000s, were always listened to by senior officers after the FSG call. So they were supervised and then listened to by the senior management team. And on the basis that there was very few FS calls in relation to the total number of calls, then that wasn't an onerous task.
Can we turn now to the separate question, which is that Jo Smith said that you never asked to consider the outcome of her call coach reviews. Is that accurate?
I certainly wouldn't have asked Jo directly that, no. I don't recall asking Scott such a specific question. It would have been a more general question in terms of the success of our QA on FSG, which could involve a number of things, of which call coach would be one.
Now, could we go back to the Lacknell Control Report, please, which we can find at HOM:01124/53. And we can see recommendation 6, which is the third box down from the head of the page, and it says this: the arrangements for the performance management of control staff should be set out clearly in a policy, including the standards that staff are expected to reach, how performance will be assessed and monitored, particularly in relation to calls where fire survival guidance is given. Now, in the action paragraph immediately below that, the recommendation is marked as completed, and it goes on to say this: since the Lacknell incident, Brigade Control senior managers have undertaken an extensive review on all high-rise or FSG calls that have occurred. Now, do you agree that the response is not an adequate answer to a recommendation that commended the setting up of a policy setting out the arrangements for performance management, particularly in relation to FSG calls?
Yeah, I think the gap here is that Policy Note 164 training wasn't sufficiently updated to recognise this. I think Control have concentrated on Policy Note 539.
So I think you accept that that action is not an answer to the recommendation. Is that a fair reading?
It's not completely inaccurate, but it could be a fuller answer if it had included 164.
Can you help us as to why a bespoke policy was not created to meet the recommendation set out here at recommendation 6?
I think because because the attention was on the creation of a new policy, i.e. 790, about fire survival guidance calls, and because as far as control were concerned, that updated policy note 539, that updated the reference information files, that updated the training documents. I think in their mind, then all of that dealt with this recommendation.
Can we now turn to LFB 000-42326? Now, this will be a document which is entitled Performance Information Folder, Operations Prevention and Response. That appears to have been prepared for the Performance Corporate Management Board in February 2014, as we can see there in the centre of the page. First of all, can you remember seeing this document at the time?
I can remember seeing documents like this. I can't recall this particular one, but this was a regular document I would have looked at.
And I think I'm right in saying that you were a regular attendee at Performance CMB, is that right?
I was, yes.
Now, if we can go to page 3, you see there the contents table. But below that, at the bottom of the page, it says prepared by ODSG. What was that body?
Operational Directorate Support Group, I think.
There's a hint of doubt in your voice there.
No,
it's not an acronym that struck you as immediately
I haven't
familiar.
seen that acronym for some time, and I think it's Operational Directorate Support Group.
Now, looking above that, in the contents table, it includes a reference to, quotes, departmental performance, including for, quotes, mobilising RMC. That appears to include control. Is that a fair reading?
Yes.
Can we go to page 68? If we turn over the page, there we go. We've got various forms of performance data in relation to control. Is that right?
Yes.
And if we go further into the document to page 73, we see there an organogram, and we've touched on this with in previous evidence, but we can see that the position of head of mobilising RMC was vacant, just below the top of the tree,
Yes.
just below you. Is that right?
Yes.
Because that was after Assistant Commissioner Chandler had left in October 2013. Is that right?
Yes.
I think, as we've discussed before, Scott Hayward was without a direct line management in the interregnum, and certainly about this time in February 2014.
Yes.
Now, if we go to page 75, we find the risk register for control. And then if we turn over the page to page 76, we have what is described as plan. Can you remember now, was the plan for control or mobilising or both?
Both.
Can you remember who developed the plan?
That would have been a joint effort between control and whoever was managing them, so either myself or Richard Chandler, or quite possibly some of before I ever came along, which were Alan Payton and John Anthony, I think, was the Assistant Commissioner at the time.
Can you remember ever seeing the plan itself? The reason I ask is it's not been possible to locate it.
Yes. This was something that I really pushed on as a way to try to manage, the overall planning of control, and we would update this throughout the year at our principal management board.
And so it would be the benchmark against which you judge performance.
Yes, at a very strategic level, yes.
Can we go further into the document to page 78 and look at item MB 44, which is roughly 2/3 of the way down the page? And it identified the following task: develop and improving upon current training practices within control. It is marked as on target, Can you help us now? What was that particular target in relation to MB44?
So it wouldn't have been a target in so much as a numerical target. It was looking at the text where it says working towards adopting the authority's standard bespoke software for planning and recording training, still awaiting full accreditation to the STEP programme. So if this was 2014, it had been before the MOPAC audit, and it was working towards getting control access to STEP and then automating STEP. So it refers to that journey that I'd mentioned.
Another signpost on the way.
Yes.
If we look at MB 44.2, the task is, and I quote, arrange ongoing control training, and that task is marked as completed. Can you remember now what the target was for that task?
No, this is. So Scott and his team would have completed the text to this. I suspect they're referring to fire survival guidance training that fell out of Lacanau, whereas strictly speaking, this should be, as I say, a more holistic approach to training. In which case, it wouldn't really have been completed.
It wouldn't have been completed.
Not if it was the holistic approach to training, because, as I've explained, it was the various component parts that they would look at as being completed, not this overall training plan.
Can you help us as to the basis on which MB 44.2 had been marked as completed?
I think because they're referring to fire survival guidance training in terms of a programme for it.
You say you think that. Is that, are you in the realms of educated guess?
Yeah. Sorry, it's an educated guess, yeah.
Not your recollection?
No.
Can we turn to MB 44.3? The task there is arrange call handling training. That is said to be, quotes, on target, close quotes. Can you help us as to what the target was for that particular task?
Well, call handling training is normal business for control staff.
And so, assuming the answer that you've given previously applies to this, for the purposes of the performance CMB, you were relying upon information provided by Scott Hayward, is that right?
Yes. So call handling training is just refresher training in the very bread and butter role of a control officer.
Other than performance CMB and the Lacknell House Board, was control training monitored by any other LFB committee, body, group?
Only when this particular departmental plan and the risk register would be presented to a performance management board, which I chaired and Scott sat on.
But the performance CMB continued to sit throughout your time at the LFB, is that right?
Yes.
Thank you. Can we now turn on to a subtopic related to training? And that's insofar as it had regard to the issues arising from the Lacknell fire, and particularly on control FSG training. And if we could turn first of all to pre-inquest action 11, which concerned the delivery of initial FSG training, which complies with national guidance to develop the performance of CROs. Now, the starting point here I'd like to take you to is your second statement and paragraph 24, which can be found at LFB 000-840-20/11. Now, here you say, in paragraph 24, at the bottom of the page, you say this: I did not have any direct involvement in the delivery of the initial FSG training to Brigade CROs. I believe this task was overseen by Scott Hayward with the support of the Brigade training officers. Did you have any indirect involvement?
Only in terms of asking for updates from Scott as to progress.
Were you involved in the review or scrutiny of the new FSG training packages?
No.
How did you satisfy yourself that the new packages satisfied the requirements of Fire Service Circular 1093 and the supplementary guidance in 5404?
because this, well, in a number of ways. So this was being completed by Scott and his team, Lindsay stroke Joe, when Joe was available, i.e. not seconded. But then there was also the Lacknell House team that Tim Cutbill and Tom Davis were involved in for various aspects of the Lacknell House recommendations. And I was receiving updates from Tim Cutbill on a frequent basis, as well as from Scott. So with those rounded conversations and also discussions at the Lacknell House board where Scott stroke Joanne were asked questions, those issues put together gave me the structure of assurance that I was required.
Could we go back to Mr. Kelly's report from August 2010, LFB 00109092, and page 6? And we can see in the bottom third of this page, under the heading Assessments and Results Recording, and at the very bottom of the page, we see paragraph 41, where Mr. Kelly said this: whilst the assessor does provide some measure of performance assessment of candidates during this role play, it is carried out in a very informal manner. There is no documented list of expected actions, behaviours against which candidates' performance should be measured, nor are there any records of performance documented at the time or after the role play. This may potentially expose the Brigade should such records wish to be scrutinised at a later date. Furthermore, candidates are exposed to only one role play scenario. Whilst there are limitations on the course in terms of time, it should be recognised that such role plays provide candidates opportunity to A. demonstrate that they have achieved the learning outcomes of the course, and to B. demonstrate under controlled conditions their current level of performance. As such, every effort should be made to ensure that candidates are given the fullest opportunity to demonstrate both A and B, and that suitable records of achievement are being kept. And we see below at 43, observed candidates have commented that the role plays they undertook were fairly straightforward and not particularly challenging. 44, opportunity therefore exists to strengthen the performance assessment element of the course. This may include lengthening the course to provide candidates with more exposure to role-play scenarios, building a robust expected actions and behaviours assessment recording sheet, providing extra assessors during the role-play elements, improving training performance recording. And we see that he then went on to recommend the following: review the role-play element of the course and ensure that a robust assessment and recording process is implemented. Now, looking at what is set out there, practical role-play appeared to be considered vital for two principal reasons. First, to ensure that learning outcomes were achieved. Secondly, to assess CRO's present level of performance and understanding. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
Did you take any steps to ensure that role play was made more robustly realistic?
Not directly, no. My involvement here would have been to discuss this with Scott and seek his assurances that he would implement this. And of course, it appeared to go in the opposite direction.
Beyond discussing matters with Scott Hayward, did you take any specific steps to ensure that Mr. Kelly's recommendations were effectively implemented?
No, apart from monitoring. So when I visited control, I would always discuss with training team when I was there, look at what they were doing, talk to staff, and then to take the strategic approach to monitoring, to look at what was going on in the brigade, how control were performing, etc. But beyond that, no, I didn't take any particular role in specifically getting involved in the course and ensuring role play. I saw that as a role for the training team and the brigade management to deal with.
Could we turn over the page and look at paragraph 55? Roughly midway down the page and under the heading Management of Level 2, Acquisition of Learning Information, Mr. Kelly said this: "The emergency call handling techniques and fire survival guidance training document states that role play should be assessed. However, little detail is provided as to how that assessment should be conducted." You see that he then went on to repeat his concerns about the robustness of the assessment process for FSG training. And at paragraph 57, he said this: "Furthermore, without the implementation of a robust assessment process, the achievement of all course learning outcomes remains unconfirmed and therefore leaves the value of the fire survival course open to challenge." Now, in relation to that particular conclusion, you commented this: "From whom and over what?" First of all, what prompted you to ask that question?
Because I felt that the content of paragraph 57, whilst valuable, it didn't go into the detail that I wanted to know. Hence, I just wanted him to expand more on what he was saying so I can make a judgment in terms of what we do with the recommendation.
Were you disagreeing with the conclusion that if FSG training failed robustly to test whether learning outcomes had been achieved, it would be susceptible to criticism from whatever quarter?
No, absolutely not. But yet equally, I just wanted to explore and scratch away at what was being said to make sure that it was a valid and appropriate comment.
Can we now put Mr. Kelly's report aside for the moment at least and go to the minutes of the Lacknell House Board on the 15th of September 2010? We can find that at LFB 000555192. And we can see at the very bottom of the page is item 5.4. And that says this: "FSG training has been reviewed to ensure it fully aligns with 1093, subject to recommendations made to CLG. All control staff have now received refresher training in FSG." Can you remember now who provided that particular update? I should note that you did attend this meeting.
Can I see the attendees, please? I noticed that Scott and Joanne were both in attendance, so it would have most likely have been Scott.
Was pre-action inquest 11, which is to deliver initial FSG training, can we take it from this document that that action was considered to have been completed by this stage, i.e. September 2010?
Yes, because I recall that action 11 was to do with moving the fire survival guidance training element in the initial entrance course, I think from the middle of the course to later in the course, and that was completed. That was a relatively simple amendment to make.
Can we turn over the page and look at item 5.8? That item says this: "LFB training came to audit control training team. They recommended introducing role play on a number of call types." Now, was the reference to an audit there a reference to Mr. Kelly's audit of August 2010?
Yes.
Can you remember now what in particular was discussed about the role play recommendation?
At the Lacknell House Board?
Yes. Giving you some more specificity, was there any discussion of the substance of Mr. Kelly's recommendations, that, for example, it be strengthened by increasing, for example, the amount of time afforded to it?
I can't recall the specifics of the discussion, but that seems not an unreasonable summary.
But you can't remember now. Can we turn to another pre-inquest action, and that is number 8. You may not recall, but it was to do with including fire safety input into FSG training to ensure that it complied with Fire Service Circular 1093. Now, for these purposes, can we look at 1093 itself, and particular Appendix B, which we can find at LFB quadruple 03617/6. There we have Appendix B, and we see at the top of the page, there's the heading structure. And that paragraph says this: the training should be presented jointly by fire control and fire safety personnel and should comprise a lecture session of 1 to 1.5 hours, followed by a practical role-play session to confirm the instruction. It then goes on to set out that fire safety officers should deliver subjects 3, which is fire safety introduction, 4, effects of fire, 5, escape from fire, 6, assessing the situation, and jointly with control, 9, which is the practical session and role play. Were you aware of that particular guidance?
Yes.
Now, if we can go back to your first witness statement, which we can find at LFB 000-321-66/21. And if we look at paragraph 65, roughly halfway down that page, you said this: it is correct that fire safety officers, FSOs, were not involved in the delivery of refresher training to control officers. Steve Turek, the AC for fire safety regulation, was satisfied that FSOs had significant involvement in the design and content of the new fire survival guidance, FSG training, for control officers, and they delivered training to new starters. To have involved FSOs in the delivery of refresher training, in mine, and as I understand AC Turek's opinion, was unnecessary, and an unnecessary use of LFB resources when there was a dedicated control training team in place to provide this training, and FSOs could be better utilised in their intended role of inspecting premises. When was that particular decision made not to involve FSOs?
This would have been in 2012, and if I can just add, it coincided with a restructure in the brigade. So prior to the middle of 2012, fire safety officers had reported through a line management chain to borough commanders, but then fire safety was taken out of that role and they reported via line management into Steve Turek.
Thank you. Could we go now to your second statement, which we can find at LFB 000-840-20/10. And if we could look at paragraph 19, which is in the top third of that page, you say this: AC Turek and I did not undertake a formal assessment in order to reach this decision, i.e. not to involve FSOs. At that time, my office was situated next to AC Turek's office. We would regularly meet face-to-face to discuss initiatives that had a joint impact on his and my teams. I have no notes of any discussion I held with AC Turek about this action point, and given the wide range of informal meetings and discussions I had with colleagues, it would have been outside of my normal practice to do so. Can you help us as to why you didn't record, even in summary form, the fact of the decision and the reasons for it?
We ultimately discussed it at board, and that was either the Departmental Management Board or the Lacknell House Management Board. But outside of that, we knew we was going to take it to a board, so I guess that's why we didn't feel the need to discuss it, or also rather document it when we had our private discussions on it.
Which board are you referring to there?
Well, it was either the Lacknell House Board or our Departmental Management Board, where the heads of service would sit and it would be chaired by the Deputy Commissioner. It was one of those two boards where we raised the issue of what we'd agreed.
Can we stay on this page and look at the next paragraph, paragraph 20, where you say this? From what I remember, AC Turek and I were satisfied that the involvement of the FSOs in the design and content of the new FSG training package was sufficient, and we jointly agreed that they should not be required to deliver the FSG refresher training to Brigade CROs. The factors that influenced that decision were, firstly, FSOs were already involved in the delivery of all initial or induction training of Brigade CROs. Secondly, based on feedback from their line managers, I was satisfied with the level of competency of the control training team to deliver all the aspects of the new FSG training package. And thirdly, given the resource constraints the Brigade was operating under, we felt that FSOs were better utilised in undertaking their core functions rather than being deployed to deliver a training package to Brigade CROs. I felt that this was a sensible way forward in light of the performance targets and budgetary constraints facing the Brigade. I accept that this decision was contrary to national guidance, but based on sound reasoning and professional judgment, it was a decision for individual fire and rescue services to exercise discretion over the extent to which they applied national guidance. Now, on what basis were you satisfied that FSO involvement in the design and content of the new FSG training package was sufficient?
So the FSOs had input into the design of the course, and on the first refresher course in 2010, they had been present. So all available control officers had been trained on a full day in 2010, and also we were by fire safety officers, and we were also maintaining the attendance of fire safety officers for new entrance training. So I was satisfied that everyone had sat opposite a fire safety officer in the last year or so.
Had you reviewed the content of the training package itself before reaching this view with AC Turek?
No, but my understanding is that Steve Turek had.
And did he say that to you directly?
Yes.
How did the decision not to involve FSOs address, for example, the requirement for FSO involvement in role-play exercises?
It was the same rationale that I felt that at Steve's request, because of the restructure and the need for him to allocate fire safety officers, which appeared to be a greater priority, and my confidence in the training team that they were able to undertake the role play element, that we could move on from refreshers without involving directly fire safety officers.
In your discussions with Mr. Turek, did either or both of you consider the extent to which FSO contribution was necessary to address the uncertainty in control about high-rise buildings and stay-put advice, which had been such a notable feature at Lacknell?
We felt that their involvement in the creation of the packages and their continuing involvement with new entrants was sufficient.
But did you specifically consider the need to address the uncertainty that had been noted in control about high-rise buildings and maintenance of stay-put advice?
We didn't have a discussion specifically about high-rise buildings, no.
What feedback or information had you received about the competency of Control's training team to provide the new FSG training package?
Well, feedback from the control management, but also my personal knowledge of the control training team, particularly 2 or 3 members that were long-standing members that were, in my view, competent trainers.
Had you been able to form a view on the competency of control staff to address matters concerning fire safety?
I hadn't witnessed that firsthand, no.
Had you done anything to satisfy yourself as to the competency of control training to deal with matters that touched upon fire safety, for example?
My assurances in those regards is that to deliver a training program is 2 essential component parts. One is a quality training package, and 2 is competent officers to deliver, and I felt that we had both of those component parts in place.
Given the issues that you raise in the paragraphs 19 and 20 of your second statement, did you consider taking this point about resources to Deputy Commissioner Dexter and saying, for example, I don't have enough resource, or FSG training resource, in order to comply with national guidance? Help.
It wasn't the issue about... The issue of resource wasn't my issue of resource, it was more fire safety's issue of resource, because with the restructure of fire safety, and the re-emphasis on post-fire audits and fire inspections, and also we were going through London Safety Plan 5, and there were efficiencies, cuts being made to a variety of departments, of which fire safety was one. It was for those reasons that we were trying to rationalise our resources.
And do you know whether Mr. Turek raised specifically with the Deputy Commissioner the need for additional FSO resource to assist FSG training?
I don't know whether that was specifically raised. I somehow doubt that Steve Turek would have raised that. It wouldn't have been his position to raise that. But absolutely, the whole issue of the numbers of fire safety inspection officers was a constant source of discussion.
Why wouldn't it have been Mr. Turek's position to have done that?
Only because his core role in terms of fire safety inspection officers was to satisfy that role of a fire safety inspection officer, which is to carry out fire safety inspections and post-fire audits.
Can we stay on this page but go to paragraph 21 of your second statement, where you say this: I note that this action point was addressed by Scott Hayward at the board meeting of 22nd of June 2010, when AC Turek and I both attended. Point 8.7 of the minutes states, annual refresher training in line with FSC 1093 is being planned, and the expectation is that all control staff will receive a biannual one-day refresher with the training team and an on-watch package, including an e-learning package from fire safety and confirmation of learning. Accordingly, by June 2010, the limitations on the intended involvement of the FSOs in the FSG continuation or refresher training had been presented to and approved by the board. Was the board told in clear and unambiguous terms of your decision that FSOs would not play a role in the provision of refresher training?
I can't recall exactly the words I used, but it certainly would have been something we would have discussed, absolutely.
Were they told, for example, that the approach that had been adopted was inconsistent with the advice in Fire Service Circular 1093?
Whether I'd have laid out in those terms, I can't recall, but I certainly wouldn't have omitted that fact. Just if I can just add...
If I could just follow up on that point, though. Here in paragraph 21, you quote the minute, which says that annual refresher training in line with FSC 1093 wouldn't it have been material to advise the board that the absence of FSO involvement was inconsistent with the advice contained in 1093. That was a material factor, wasn't it?
Absolutely, and it may well, I'm sure it would have been the case that we did raise that. This is just obviously the way the minutes were taken. But
it's a pertinent fact to say they obviously considered it to be sufficiently important to record that the training was in line with FSC 1093, but it's equally important in those circumstances to note that it's materially inconsistent with 1093, isn't it?
Yeah, I can see that the minutes don't necessarily support the point I'm trying to make now, yes.
So it's nearly quarter past
just
11.
about.
But this would be an appropriate time.
Is it a good time for you?
Sir, can I
Yes.
just briefly just add just a footnote to what we were just saying? So one of the discussions that we were constantly having is the fact that around this time was London safety plans, but based on what we called integrated risk management plan. Mm-hmm. So the whole point of an integrated risk management plan was to devolve more thinking to fire services in terms of how they delivered their service. So the government had moved away from things like attendance times and left it up to fire services to decide when that they would, how often, how frequent they would attend an incident. So the reason I raise this is because on the one hand we've got national guidance from what was 17 years ago at this point in time, or 19 years ago. And then on the other hand, we've got a loosening, a devolvement in terms of thinking, very much encouraging fire services to think about what's best for them. So it was in the background of that we were very much thinking, Steve Turek and I, about what's best for the London Fire Brigade and the way we allocate our resources, which comparing it to national guidance from 93, I can see why the line of questioning that's being levelled, but nevertheless, the environment was completely different in terms of devolved thinking.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you very much. Do you want to follow that up at all at this
No,
point?
thanks.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Brown. We'll take our short break now, and we'll come back, please, at 11:30, and then carry on then. All
Thank
right.
you.
And please, as before, don't talk to anyone about your evidence.
Okay, thank you.
When you're out of the room. Thank you. Right, thank you very much. 11:30, please. Would you ask Mr. Brown to come back in, please? Right, Mr. Brown, all ready to carry on? I hope.
Yes, thank you, sir.
Good. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Kinnear, when you're
Thanks,
ready.
sir. Can we go back to the minutes of the Lacknell House board meeting of the 15th of September 2010, which you attended, and which can be found at LFB 000555192/1. And we can see again, we looked at it earlier on, we see at the bottom of the page, paragraph 5.4 says this: FSG training has been reviewed to ensure it fully aligns with 1093. Subject to recommendations made by CLG, all control staff have now received refresher training in FSG. And if we could look at 5.5, a full day of refresher training. If we turn over the page. Thank you. A full day of refresher training has been introduced, half of which is delivered by the fire safety team. Role play has also been introduced. Now, at that stage, on the face of the minutes, the board was not told about any constraints or limits or exceptions to compliance with 1093. Do you agree with that?
I can't see anything in the minutes to that effect. No, that's correct.
On the contrary, they were given explicit assurance that training was fully aligned with 1093 and that fire safety would deliver half of the refresher training. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
That tends to suggest that the decision that you and Mr. Turek reached was made after this meeting in September 2010. Does that sound about right?
Yes, I realise in my statement I mentioned 2010, but sitting here now, I think it was closer to 2012 when the structural change was made.
Thank you. As that was the necessary context which
Yes,
you set
yes.
out to the panel earlier.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Hayward said that he didn't recall knowing anything about the decision that you and Mr. Turek reached and couldn't recall discussing it with you. Can you remember, did you ever discuss the particular subject of the involvement of FSOs in the provision of refresher FSG training to control staff?
I'm sure I did, because I wanted the assurance that the control officers could deliver the training in the absence of fire safety staff, and also because I wanted to make sure Scott was involved in things that were happening rather than having things done to control.
Could we turn to the Lacknell Control Report again, which can be found at HOM *01124/53. And if we could look at action 4.2b. Thank you. And we can see there that the coroner was informed that continuation refresher FSG training for CROs included, and I quote, inputs from Brigade fire safety officers covering aspects of building design and construction, coupled with current fire safety advice to educate control officers on fire behaviour and building types. Can you help us as to why the coroner was not informed about your decision not to involve FSOs in refresher FSG training?
No, I can see 4.2b doesn't mention that. I mean, 4.2 talks about in the context of the initial training in August 2010, but I accept that it doesn't go on to say that subsequent decisions have been made.
Can you help us as to why not?
No, it certainly wasn't the intention to keep it from the coroner. I suspect it was because it was an internal decision and we felt that we were still meeting what we needed to meet. But I accept that it doesn't explicitly say that, no.
Can we turn to a separate pre-action action now, which is pre-action 12, that dealt with the recurring programme of FSG training. And could we start with 1093 on this point, which can be found at LFB 3617/2. And if we could look at paragraph 7 in particular. Now you'll see the heading for paragraph 7 is continuation of training. And the paragraph in particular says this: following completion of initial training, when the recruit is attached to the watch, further continuation training should be carried out progressively with the aim of improving skills and knowledge gradually. This should include the training set out in Appendix B. Were you aware of that particular guidance?
Yes.
Now, we touched on this earlier, but if we could go to Appendix B, which is found at page 6 of the circular, we can see the particular advice and requirements in relation to FSG training, which covered 9 distinct topics delivered in part by FSOs and with practical role play to confirm the instruction. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
Do you agree, therefore, that the expectation in 1093 was that continuation FSG training would be delivered to this syllabus and to this method?
The expectation in the guidance, yes.
Now, if we can stay in this circular, but go to back to page 3 and paragraph 11. You'll see paragraph 11 has the heading Watch Refresher Training, and it says this: it is recommended that on-watch refresher training should be given to all fire control staff on a systematic basis, i.e. it should be both scheduled and monitored. The subject matter will depend on local circumstances, but emphasis should be given to little-used procedures or areas of weakness. It is recommended that brigade training officers should be encouraged to participate in the training to augment the efforts of fire control officers. Were you aware of that particular recommendation?
Yes.
Was FSG call handling a little-used procedure as well as an area of weakness, having regard to the problems that had been identified following the Lacknell fire?
It was, I would agree, it was a little-used procedure operationally, because purely statistically that bears that out. In terms of an area of weakness, no, I wouldn't say it was an area of weakness. I would say that it was certainly an area that the Lacknell House Action Plan had highlighted, but I think that was because of the some of the traumatic issues that were associated with Lacknell. The issue of fire survival guidance for control staff in general, I wouldn't say it was an area of weakness, but yet equally I would say it's something that was open for continual improvement, as everything is.
And indeed, as you said, it seems statistically it was a little-used procedure.
Yeah, statistically I couldn't argue against the fact it is a little-used procedure.
And so to use the wording of the circular, FSG refresher training needed to be emphasised to control staff. Would you accept that?
Yes.
Now, if we can go to LFB 00118948/1. Again, this is a document we looked at last week. It's Keeping People Safe from 1994. It's the FSG training package that accompanied Fire Service Circular 1093. And if we go to page 12, you see there the heading for fire survival guidance, and below in the bottom third of the page, the heading training requirement, and continuation is the very last subheading on that page. It says this: refresher training is recommended at intervals of not more than 12 months. Were you aware of that particular form of advice?
Yes.
Now, can we put that aside and go to the minutes of the Lacknell House Board from the 22nd of June 2010, and that can be found at LFB 000844029/3. And I take it from you attended, but could we look at item 8.7? And it says this: annual refresher training in line with FSC 1093 is being planned, and the expectation is that all control staff will receive a biannual one-day refresher with the training team and an on-watch package, including an e-learning package from Fire Safety and the confirmation of learning. Can you remember now who provided that information to the Lacknell House Board meeting?
It would have, almost certainly have been provided by whichever of the senior control management team were in attendance with me. It was rarely, if ever, the case that I was there without one of either Joe or Scott.
Now, bearing in mind the meeting was more than 11 years ago, are you able to help us now with the substance of any discussion about, for example, the relevant terms of 1093 or the particular requirements of the Keeping People Safe guidance?
It'd just be educated guesses, I'm afraid. I can't say for sure.
Can you remember, though, mindful of that, whether there was any discussion of whether the actions that had been taken fully met the pre-inquest action?
I remember discussion on these at board meetings, whether it was this one or just in general, and we were quite open that we were going to do an alternate approach. And when I say biannual, that's not strictly true, it's biennial. So 1 day full, 1 year full day, 1 year half day, 1 year full day, 1 year half day. And the half days would be CBT packages. So we were quite open about that. We were quite open that fire safety had inputted into both of those. And I am of the view that we were quite open to the fact that fire safety would not be involved in refresher courses apart from the initial 2010 refresher course.
Now, pressing you on this, we saw that Keeping People Safe recommended that refresher training was recommended at intervals of not more than 12 months. Did you consider that provision of e-learning every other year gave sufficient emphasis to FSG training, mindful of the advice in 1093, and also mindful of the LFB's experience following Lacknell?
CBT was something that was becoming routine in the brigade. It was an accepted approach. It wasn't popular with all members of staff, that's for sure. But nevertheless, it was organisationally an efficient way of delivering training. And I was of the opinion that given all the competing factors, all the issues to take into account, the fact that it was part of initial training, the fact that there was a full day on refresher training every year, that having CBT every in-year, as it were, was a reasonable approach.
What was the problem preventing you from providing full FSG training every year as recommended by 1093 and Keeping People Safe?
So by having full training, which would involve a trainer, then you have the training room that's probably equipped for about 6 or 7 members of staff. So you've got 96 staff in control. So straight away, that's about 16 courses that you would need to be able to do that, plus mop-up courses, because inevitably you wouldn't get everyone. Something would happen and someone wouldn't be able to attend. So it suddenly becomes a significant workload for a training team that are already delivering a range of other training events as well. So if we can utilise computer-based training where operations managers can deal with it, what I would call locally, and they can find periods of quiet, quite possibly at 3 o'clock in the morning maybe, and where they could go through issues with their staff then. So it seemed a far more efficient way of dealing with the training than it would be to have a trainer come in every year.
Can we look at LFB 000555213, which are minutes of a Lacknell House Board meeting from the 8th of November 2010. You didn't attend or weren't able to attend. If we could look at the foot of page 1 and item 4.6 in particular, it says this, action point 12, the one we're discussing about refresher training. The bulk of this is complete. Training is being completed for any staff on sick, etc., when the original training was carried out. A computer-based CBT package for 2011 is now being formulated. Every other year, the full package will be used with a refresher CBT course in between. It would appear, therefore, that the biennial plan had been approved before this date. Is that a fair reading of that item?
I believe so, yes.
And that's an approach with which you were content, or at
Yes.
least had sanctioned?
Yes.
Now, if we can stay in this document and go to page 6, and you'll see, as against action 12, and the top of the page, it records in the, what would it be, the 5th column to the left, 8th of November 2010, CBT package being formulated for alternate years, and in the far right column, the action is marked yes as complete. Now, Mr. Hayward said that the action was closed at that meeting based on assurances about the delivery of that biennial plan. Can you remember now whether the board formally approved that approach?
The fact that it was marked as yes would only be marked at yes if it had formally approved. So it wouldn't be me that was marking it as yes. It would be the minute taker who would have taken the lead from the chair to say mark as complete. So yes, I am satisfied that it was marked as complete at that meeting.
The marking of something as complete to the lay eye is somewhat surprising, given the subject matter is continuing training. The LACNOR board meetings, I think, continued till September 2013 or thereabouts.
Yes.
Was the continued oversight of the board not considered necessary in relation to this particular action plan then?
It was. I think I should just explain the context of when we say complete. If we're not careful, then recommendations can stay open for a significant amount of time, and you kind of need to ask yourself the question, when is something complete? And in our view, complete was when the system for delivery had been established, not necessarily when all delivery had been established.
Could we now turn on to a separate but linked topic, and it's the one you've touched on previously, and that's the delay in terms of implementing computer-based training packages. And the first document I'd like to take to is an email from Mr. Hayward, which was sent to SOM Turner, and you weren't copied in. That email can be found at LFB 000 580 77/2. Now, 12th of May 2011, Scott Hayward emailed Mr. Turner asking, "Can you let me know how we are training staff in FSG this year, please, and a timeline?" Now we see, if we go to the foot of page 1, I see it's Lindsay Turner. Is that a he or a she?
It's a she.
She then forwarded the email on to a Nicola O'Shea and Christine Sharp and said this: "We are still waiting to hear from Steve Smith re the CBT issue, but I think this is not likely to happen in time for us to achieve this for this year. So please can you look at a timeline for delivering the training via PPT, PowerPoint presumably,
Yes.
which was our reserve plan for this year, and also when this will be ready to go and watches can start." Can you remember now, were you informed at this time that CBT would not be provided in 2011?
I don't specifically remember being informed, but I would have. There was so much traffic going on about it. I can't see how I wasn't made aware at some point.
It's a level of detail that you'd expect to be
Yes,
updated on.
Absolutely, yes.
Now, if I can go to Mr. Hayward's statement at this point, his second statement, and that can be found at LFB 000 86213/11. And we can see paragraph 55 there in the top half of that page. Could we look at the second line of that paragraph in which he says this? "In 2011, refresher training was delivered by way of self-study, where staff were able to review the training presentation," and he refers to an exhibit. Were you informed at this particular time that refresher training, rather than being facilitated online or in person, was to be achieved by what's described as a self-study review of the training materials?
A similar answer. I can't remember exactly the point, but at some point it was common knowledge.
Would you accept that what's euphemistically described as self-study is a significant deviation from the recommendation contained in FSC 1093?
Well, certainly 1093 talks about facilitated, and self-study is clearly not facilitated. So yes, I will be more concerned though that if the content was significantly different rather than the manner in which the information was imparted.
And it's substantially different from what the Lacknell House Board had been led to believe would be implemented. Would you accept that?
It was, but nevertheless, there was reason for it. It wasn't a deliberate decision to ignore it.
Could we now turn to the Lindridge Review and its first iteration in January 2013? And if we can go to LFB 000-858-54/12. We've gone to this a number of times. It has, in the comment boxes, the record of the conversation you had with Rita Dexter regarding certain of the points identified by Mr. Lindridge. And we see here on page 12, as against Action 8, not Action 12, but Action 8, Mr. Lindridge wrote this. FSC 1093 recommends FSG refresher training is conducted annually. In LFB, the full FSG training package is now conducted every other year. Reading down. For the alternate years, a computer-based training CBT package has been developed. This does not include the input of an FSO, but it is worth noting that the national guidance is not definitive as to what is expected for refresher training. It is also worth noting that the CBT was not available in 2011, and a locally produced PowerPoint presentation was used to deliver refresher training. The CBT will be used from 2013. Now, if we can go to the top of page 13, you'll see there that Rita Dexter commented, "Am I right?" It's in the very top of that page in blue, and track change. "Am I right in concluding that we agreed something that happened once, 2010, and since then it's all gone awry?" To which you replied, consolingly it may be thought, "Not at all. The fact is that full training was given in 2010, a locally produced PowerPoint in 2011, due to the CBT not being ready, full training in 10-12, you mean 2012 there?
Yes.
CBT in 2013, full training in 2014, etc. Can you help us now why Mrs. Dexter had formed the impression that after 2010, FSG training had, quote, gone all awry?
Well, I think it was purely on the basis of Dave Lindridge's comments.
She said nothing further to you in any discussions you might have had. It was solely on the basis of Lindridge, as far as you recall.
I think that was what prompted it. Rita and I spoke daily, and so I've sent her this reply. This would inevitably have come up in subsequent discussions, but in my mind, I felt it was reasonable to assure her not at all, because subject to influences outside of our control, we were meeting the spirit of what we were asked to meet as best we could.
Can we turn over the page to page 14 and go down to Action 12, which is in the top half of the page? And against the sentence which read, "All control personnel complete FSG training on an annual basis," Rita Dexter asked this: "Please tell me how many did complete it each year since 2010, expressed as X out of Y for each year, please." And then you replied, giving the statistics. In 2010, 108 of 116 staff have been refreshed. 2011, 106 of 116 staff have been refreshed. 2012, 94 of 104 staff have been refreshed. She then asked, "Are there any who have not done it in any year?" To which you replied, "No, all staff have completed at least one refresher session." Now, Mr. Hayward said that you did not get that information from him. First of all, is that right?
Well, I would have. So I did go through Scott for everything. If he is adamant that I didn't get it from him, then it must have been because he was unavailable or on leave, in which case I would have gone to a SOM. But I certainly would have gone through the line management chain. That was my normal practice, and one I specifically and religiously followed.
If we can go back in the document to page 6. And if we can scroll up to what Mr. Lindridge said in his key findings section about pre-inquest action 12, again, just roughly a third of the way down the page, he wrote this in the first paragraph. Control training records have no recorded FSG training for 2 watches, so that's watches 2 and 3 in 2011. Conversations with members of control staff and managers suggest that this is a recording error. Were you aware of that particular finding?
I was when it was made here, yes. I wasn't prior to this.
Now, mindful of that, can we go back to page 14 and the statistics that you identified for those 3 particular years? And if your comments can be expanded, my question is this. How did you reconcile the finding we've just looked at page 6 with the information you communicated here, that 106 of 116 had been refreshed in 2011, if there were no records for 2 of the watches on the basis of 16 staff per watch?
It was my belief that training was going on, but it wasn't being recorded. And my recollection is that when and bearing in mind that Dave Lindridge was giving me updates on his progress on his review, so when I read it here, this wasn't the first time I was aware of it. It's my recollection that when I was made aware that there was a gaping hole in 2 of the watches, that I discussed this with Scott and said to him basically, is this the case that no training has gone on, or is it the case that training has gone on and it's just not being recorded? And it was the latter. And so my recollection is that on that basis, then those watches were spoken to and the training that they knew they'd carried out was entered, hence these figures.
At this point, did you ever have pause for thought, given the concerns that had been raised historically about record keeping, that these statistics were not in fact reliable?
My concern was the fact that there was spreadsheets not being filled in. That was my real concern. It wasn't the concern so much that training wasn't happening, because I was confident it was. It's just the recording was the thing that bothered me.
There is no doubt or caveat or reservation expressed here, though, about the reliability of the statistics, so that Mrs. Dexter was aware of the.
No, this is true. I haven't caveated these. No, but I wouldn't have provided those figures if I thought that they were in any way some kind of guess or an estimate. I'd only provide these figures on the basis that I was assured they were accurate.
Now, could we keep this particular document on the screen, but put alongside it another one, which is LFB 000555191/26, and the table of staff who'd carried out some FSG training, which Mr. Hayward had identified at paragraph 74 of his statement. Now, you don't need to be a professional statistician, Mr. Brown, to see that the figures are very different. And looking at 2012, for example, we can see that Mr. Hayward said it was 58 staff out of a total of 86 who had been trained. That can be compared and contrasted with the statistic which you provided to Mrs. Dexter, which was 94 out of 104. Are you able to explain such a marked inconsistency between the 2 statistics?
I can only say in the kindest possible way I've absolutely no faith in these figures in Scott's statement. That for me, they completely lack credibility.
Now, Mr. George said that as well. Can you help us as to the principal reasons why you think the statistics below paragraph 74 lack credibility?
Well, one is the wild deviation in the numbers of staff that existed over the years. That's just not an accurate reflection of the staffing available. And then also in 2015 it says 0%, and just from my experience, nothing is ever that absolute. If it had said 100%, I equally wouldn't have believed it. It just does not ring true. And on that basis, the numbers of staff and that 0%, and also what we know was going on. I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that the curve that this suggests, which is a downward curve from 13 through to 16, isn't accurate. I think that is accurate, but the level to which this curve sinks, I think, completely lacks credibility.
Mr. Hayward was not able to explain the discrepancy either, so it may well be the panel will have to form their own view in due course. Can we move on to a separate topic, which is the reduction of time to 4 hours for training and the absence of role play? And the starting document I'd like to take you to is an email from a Thomas Davis to Mr. Hayward seeking information for the inquests. And if we find that at LFB 000-608-72/3. And we see the email at the bottom of the page sent on the 6th of February 2013. And we see that Mr. Davis at point 2 asked the following. We need some clarity about what refresher training takes place. Is it every other year, all day, with role play and fire safety officers, and the other year computer-based on watch? I'm afraid we still aren't clear about the situation. We've told the coroner in the report that it is full-day training. If it isn't, we need to have a detailed answer why we've modified this position and precisely what the position retraining is now. Now, first of all, Mr. Davis, the email there is legal, and he's an in-house lawyer at LFB, is that right?
That's correct.
Now, the reference is to the Lacknor Control Report, is that right?
Yes.
Now, if we stay in this chain but go on to page 2, we see on the 7th of February 2013 at 06:11 hours a response from Mr. Hayward. It's a partial response. That's unfair. It's a response to the first part of the request in the second paragraph from the very bottom. And what he says is this, and it's in the blue text: a management decision was made that trainers and an FS officer would provide training every other year, as with this year. In between, staff will access the information we have made available, which we then validate with role play. Next year, staff will access the Knowledge Centre and complete the CBT packages. Just to confirm, the first FSG training in 2010 was a full day's training. 2011 staff access PowerPoint presentations. Excuse me.
Bless you.
And we validated with role play. 2012, trainers and a fire safety officer provided half a day's training. 2013, staff will complete the online CBT packages. And then if we go on further, we see in response to the second part at the very bottom of the page, he says this: it was assessed. If we can go further down. And agreed by the training manager that refresher training did not need to take a full day. To utilise the on-watch training allocation, the training took place from 1,400 hours to 1,800 hours. When we started the training in 2010, the training itself took 7 hours, including lunch and breaks. The training has just been condensed into the time frame allocated, and not so much time has been to the subject on difficult calls. Mock FSG calls are also recorded and played back to the trainees to identify shortfalls in the delivery of the call. Now, if we can go back to page 2 of this chain, and we can see that he forwarded the email to you at 12:53, and we find that in the top part of this page, with one line which says, "Some further detail as discussed this morning." Now, in relation to that discussion, Mr. Hayward had separately emailed SOM Bagnall, Vic Bagnall, and we can find that email at LFB 000 39935/1. We've seen this on a number of occasions, Mr. Brown. Mr. Hayward says this: "Morning, Vic. I've just had my arse kicked about the length of the full FSG training. In the report, we say it is a full day, and yet we have just carried out the training of 4 hours with no role play. Dave was very unhappy and made it very clear to me. It makes us look unprofessional in court. I appreciate that you have just picked this up, but we need tighter control of the trainers and not let them freelance as they appear to have done on this occasion." Is arse-kicking the appropriate description to the discussion you'd had with Mr. Hayward?
Not literally, but it was a...
Metaphorically?
It was a very clear discussion we had, yes. Yeah.
Had you not been previously told that the length of full FSG refresher training had been reduced and that it didn't include role play?
No, I'd only become aware of it based on the discussions that we've just alluded to.
Mr. Hayward said that you told him to get the role play and duration of training, quotes, back to the way they were. Is that right?
Absolutely, yes.
And by that, did you mean full day refresher training when not the CBT year and active, practical and assessed role play?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, if we can return to the parallel email correspondence that was going on at this time, and we can go back to LFB 000 60872. And here we can see that you emailed Mr. Hayward on the 9th of February 2013, seeking his views on the position that you had set out in relation to training. Now, under the heading Refresher Training, just further down the page. Thank you. Can we look at the second bullet point and what it says? A half-day's training was given in 2011. The reason this was a half-day is due to the amount of resources required for a full day's training year on year, and how this needs to be balanced with other training commitments as well as workload in control. Who informed you that a half-day's training was given in 2011? Was it Mr. Hayward?
Yes.
Now, as we've looked at a few moments ago, Mr. Hayward said the training in 2011 was by way of a self-study of a PowerPoint. Did he correct you on that point?
I believe so, because I'll go on to say in this that records show that we used a PowerPoint presentation.
Was it Mr. Hayward who told you that training had been reduced to half a day because of a resource issue and the need to balance other training and workload and control?
Yes.
Did you accept that explanation in the sense of being content with it?
I accepted it in terms of it had been and gone and it had happened, so that was a matter of fact. In terms of being content with it, no.
What steps did you take to overcome the obstacles that are set out here so as to ensure that full and proper FSG training was provided and prioritised appropriately?
Well, to make it clear, well, first of all, I think, just to put some brief context to it, the reason it was changed was, in the minds of those who had made that decision at a training level, was made for the best of intentions. It wasn't a deliberate scheme to ignore what they were asked to do. Where my frustration is the fact that it had happened without anyone's knowledge, including Scott's. So I told him to just return it to the way it was, regardless of whatever the reasons were for changing it. And if we needed to address it again in the future, then we'd have a proper discussion where we'd sit down and properly assess the reasons and look at it in the round.
Can we look at the foot of this page?
Of course.
It's your final sentence of your email where you said this. In the future, training will consist of alternate full days training as specified in the report. And I think you're referring there to the Latinal Control Report. And half-day CBT packages. Therefore, in 2013, a full day's training will be delivered, and in 2014, a half-day CBT package, then in 2015, a full day, and so on. Put bluntly, that was your expectation as to the future provision of FSG training, is that right?
Yes, and I had deliberately switched the order because it was 2010 full day, therefore 2012, therefore 2014, even years. And I'd switched the order because I was conscious that in 11 it was a half day, I'll now realise it was 12 a half day, and 13, if I'd have stuck to the original order, would have also been a half day. So I was concerned that this deviation from the plan would have an ongoing effect. So that is why I switched it round.
Now, you referred there to the report, which we understand to be the Latinal Control Report. Could we go back and look at what the control report in fact said? And for that purpose, could we go to HOM quadruple 0 1124/53? We looked at this earlier on this morning, and if we look at the action under 4.2, and if we look at little a, the recommendation of the Latinal Control Report was this: role play to ensure confirmation of learning was introduced into training. This allows all new and existing staff to experience a number of FSG call scenarios in a safe, supportive environment. Go down to C. FSG training has been extended to encompass whole day training. Now, bearing in mind what you discovered, and bearing in mind what this report said, did you update or cause the coroner to be updated that in fact role play had not been provided to staff as described in the control report?
Well, the email that we were just looking at, the one I'd sent to Scott for his views, my recollection is that email was designed to be sent to the Lakenham House inquiry team, who would then use it to inform the coroner. So I'd run it past Scott for his views to make sure that I was factually correct in what I was saying, because I based it on discussions and previous email chains. So yes, that was to be shared with the coroner by the team during the inquest.
And equally the point that the duration of the FSG training had similarly not been as intended by the Latinal Control Report. Was
Yes.
that another point which you wanted to be communicated to the coroner?
Yes. So I made it aware because of Tom Davis's proactive work in asking these questions, which is how I found out about it. This was our response and this was our position for the team then to share with the coroner during the inquest.
Can I now turn to a separate topic, and that's information provided to the Health and Safety Executive in 2014. And the first document I'd like to go to is an email you sent to Adrian Bevan, who's at the LFB, on the 3rd of July 2014, which can be found at LFB 000 374 28/1. Now, you see your email on the 3rd of July there, 1406. This is a response to a number of requests the Health and Safety Executive had made of the London Fire Brigade in relation to control training. And if we could turn over the page to page 2, and if we can look at the first point C on that page, the first words of which are training delivery, and it's the top third of the page, and it says this: training delivery, detail of attendance of staff at training, i.e. collective training records, when and how many staff, etc. Now, you replied thus: 277 individual fire survival guidance training sessions have been carried out, run by senior control officers, in addition to the regular control watch training sessions. These training sessions took place between February 2011 and June 2014. all available control officers have received additional training in call handling techniques and handling of fire survival guidance calls. Now, first of all, what was an individual fire survival guidance training session?
That would have been the full day, half day approach.
Was the regular control watch training the annual FSG refresher training?
No. So in addition to regular control watch training sessions, what I meant by that is whatever the operations manager had determined was appropriate for his or her watch based on individual training needs.
What was the additional training in call handling techniques and handling of fire survival guidance calls?
I'm just reading through.
No, please do.
Point 1 and 2 again. Well, I think that's really just underlining point 1. So in point 1, where I say 277 individual fire survival guidance training sessions have been carried out, I mean just underlining the point that all available controllers have received the additional training, because that is additional training.
Was Mr. Hayward the source of the information contained in this email, including the statistic of 277?
I always went through Scott if he wasn't available, so either him or one of his senior operations managers.
This is another instance where Mr. Hayward has no recollection of providing the information, and said that you may have asked the SOM or OST. From what you've said, that might be a possibility. Would you accept that?
Not straight to the OST, it wouldn't, because that just wasn't the way I worked. But one of the SOMs, possibly, but only if Scott wasn't available. If Scott was available, I would have made. I say would because I know, bearing in mind the issues we've discussed, I would go through him absolutely to get the information, because I wanted him to be part of this whole performance management approach. If I went around a person, all that does is just compound the existing performance management issues.
What's striking here is that you haven't sought to provide the executive with the year-on-year breakdown that you provided to Rita Dexter. Can you help us as to why that breakdown was not provided to the executive?
Is it possible to see points A and B, what I've said?
Yes, of course.
And sorry, in point C again, please. No particular reason. I think I'm just looking at the questions I'm being asked. It hasn't asked for that particular breakdown. They've just asked for detail of attendance of staff at training, so I've given them a collective figure.
Can I now go back to the MOPAC audit? And again, that can be found at LFB 000444640/25, and it's the report summary we looked at earlier on. Again, if we can look at the third column, the central one, and the bottom row, which is under the heading rating/medium, and it starts with the words failure to effectively monitor. And it says this: failure to effectively monitor the receipt of FSG training could result in staff receiving insufficient levels of this mandatory training. This could result in reputational damage in the event of a serious incident involving persons trapped being dealt with by staff who had not received the required level of training. And in the row below that, failure to ensure that training records are accurately maintained could result in training levels being inappropriately reported and/or staff not receiving the required training, potentially leading to an inappropriate response to an incident. Did you agree with the identification of those particular risks?
Yes, I certainly agree that they are. That's an accurate description. of what could occur, yes.
Did it occur to you that beyond reputational damage, a failure to ensure that staff had been properly trained in relation to FSGs may in certain circumstances lead to death or at least serious injury?
Yeah, I can assure you that the reputational issue, whilst obviously important, wouldn't be the driver for me. The driver is to actually make sure that we are providing the best possible service to the people that need us.
Now, the agreed action in relation to FSG training was, and it's probably easier if we go to the preceding page, it said this: an independent report. You see it's in the bottom right-hand corner. Sorry, these things are sometimes quite difficult to read. The agreed action was an independent report of the provision of fire survival guidance training for all control staff will be maintained and monitored to ensure that all staff are in receipt of this training at least annually. A monthly report will be produced by OST, providing the annual FSG training update, and we will be directing OMs to notify the training team if individuals are nearing their annual refresher so we can get them on a refresher course. Now, if we go to LFB 000-59597/1, we find an updated version of this particular report. Now, what we see here is an addition of the agreed actions have been assigned and control comments in the far right-hand side column. If we go to page 2, and I want to look at the bottom row of the third column, we can see that SOM Smith was assigned the action to maintain and monitor the monthly records, and that had been marked as completed. Now, having regard to that endorsement, what steps did you take to make sure that an independent record of FSG training had in fact been created?
The only steps I would have taken would be to use this report as a basis for discussion, to assure myself, so basic discussion with Scott or whoever was deputising for him, and then when I visit control, in my discussions with staff or control team, to satisfy myself that I feel the outcomes are working accurately. I wouldn't go any further than that in terms of physically inspecting the records.
Now, Mr. Hayward said in his evidence that the focus was solely on vision training at this time, so mid-2015, and that while a record would have been set, he doubted whether any other work would have been done. Were you aware of the limited extent to which work had been done on this topic?
Certainly, Scott and I had discussions about vision and the all-consuming nature of the training around it, yes.
Now, if we can go back to your second statement on this point, which can be found at LFB 000-84020/13. We see at paragraph 28, and particularly the final line, in relation to your monthly meetings with Mr. Hayward, you say this: at the meetings, therefore, I would require Scott to report back to me with up-to-date statistics on the delivery of those targets, that are the targets we've been discussing. Now, after the MOPAC audit in February 2015, Mr. Hayward did not recall you requesting up-to-date statistics on FSG training being delivered. First of all, is that right?
Quite possibly, because we had reached the position where Vision was due to go live. I was discussing with Capita the reasons why we couldn't accept it, and everything was about Vision. So my recollection is the agreement that I'd reached with Scott was I can see the severe challenges in terms of trying to adhere to the fire survival guidance training. So the assurances I sought was that what was the level of competency of his staff. So we had a number of new entrants that had received training in terms of fire survival guidance, and then we had others who had received the packages relatively recently. So I asked for a training needs analysis to determine that we made sure that there was no one that was in need of fire survival guidance training that wasn't having it, and that we'd have to accept the risk at that moment in time that we wasn't adhering to what had fallen out of the Lackland House Action Plan because of the immense training that was going on with vision.
You say everything was about vision. Mr. George gave the impression that vision and the technical problems left little time for anything else. You seem to agree with that.
There was other things going on, but certainly it was by far and away the biggest show in town.
Going back to your second statement, looking at paragraph 29, which is on the screen at the moment, you said this: I was left with the impression that FSG refresher training was, where practically possible, being delivered. I gained that impression from my discussion with Scott, but also my discussion with individual brigade CROs when I visited them in their workplace. Now, there appears to be a euphemistic phrase there, where practically possible. What precisely did you mean by that?
Where resources allowed, and it wasn't just the availability of the control officers. It was the fact that we had training officers that were being drawn away to write training packages and deliver training for vision. So much so that I agreed to increase the staffing from the operational support team, I think from 4 to 6, to be able to service this demand. And so where practically possible was when there was a trainer available, when there were staff available, and just also when they had the how can I put it, the headspace, if you like, to be able to receive this refresher training, because so much was being pumped into staff in terms of a completely new way of working.
Now, you say there that that was an impression that you had formed. The point that rises from that is, why didn't you know what the state of play was in relation to the provision of FSG training, given that it had consumed so much attention at the Lacknell inquest and thereafter?
So when you say no, I didn't know the actual figures, but I had reached the position where I was comfortable for that moment in time to deviate from it in terms of the assurances about staff being given training in fire survival guidance calls relatively recently, be it through new entrants. And so by the time I left, I think about a third of staff were new entrants. So therefore, as a matter of fact, they would have received training within the last few years, which is not what the Lacknell Action Plan was asking for, but we had this massive competing priority. So I knew strategically what was going on. I didn't necessarily know exactly, specifically, how many staff had received it that actual year.
Can I now move on to a separate issue, which is the apparent absence of refresher training from 2015 onwards? And the useful starting point for this is paragraph 30 of your second statement, which is at the bottom of the screen now. You say this there. Scott made me aware when there were occasions when FSG refresher training was not being delivered in accordance with agreed timescales. This occurred when there were competing priorities in brigade control. For example, in 2015 to 2017, a considerable amount of time was invested in training brigade CROs on the vision mobilising system, which meant there was an impact on the delivery of FSG refresher training during that period. The vision mobilising system was a risk-critical project, which was crucial that the brigade delivered on time. And Mr. Hayward said in evidence that he told you, what would have been 2015, that the only training taking place was vision training. Does that accord with your recollection?
No, because there was other training going on. There was training in resource management and the National Coordinating Centre, where we were more formalised in that. So there were other training. There was other training going on, but it is true that vision was by far and away the biggest piece of training and did dominate everything else.
Given the issues that had been identified most recently by MOPAC, and in particular the risks that they'd identified for the brigade, what more were you doing to ensure that FSG refresher training was not squeezed out by the onerous demands of vision training?
So increasing the operational support team, so there were more trainers available, putting real pressure on Capita to provide trainers to assist with vision, giving as much support around visions, which therefore by default left more time to do the other training for which we were committed. And then having an end date in sight in terms of when vision will be introduced and when the training could start to slow down, so we could therefore pick up our commitments with other training.
Given what had happened at Lacknell, given what MOPAC had identified, would you also agree that refresher training was risk critical?
Yes, yes, we could call fire survival guidance training could be described as risk critical. We were though still monitoring what was going on with it. So I refer back to our earlier discussion that every fire survival guidance call was monitored and reviewed thereafter. So whilst I accept that the amount of refresher training wasn't in accordance with what we had promised, there was a unfortunate but yet sound reason for it, and B, there was continual quality assurance of it. So it wasn't as if the whole topic had been completely sidelined.
But would you accept that the practical result was that FSG refresher training was not given the priority it deserved following Lacknell, and in particular given the risks identified by MOPAC in early 2015?
At that particular moment in time, it wasn't in accordance with what we had imagined, but we'd equally hadn't imagined that vision was going to take up this amount of time that it was doing. So over the whole period, and also we shouldn't forget, whilst I wouldn't offer this as a substitute for the year-on-year fire survival guidance training, we were also running the courses around information transfer to the fire ground in accordance with Policy Note 790. So there was other FSG training going on. So what with the monitoring of calls and the use of call coach and the Policy Note 790, there was an array of issues that did shine a light on fire survival guidance, although I will accept that what is missing is the training that was expected, but yet it was missing for good reason, because without a mobilising system, then everything else falls by the wayside.
Now, flowing on from that, can we go back to your first statement, which can be found at LFB 000-32166/21, and paragraph 66 in particular? Now, what you say here is 5 lines down this. Following the rollout of the initial FSG training after the Lacknell House fire, there were no service delivery criticisms of the control staff on FSG calls, which gave me any cause to question whether refresher training was taking place. Now, did the service delivery criticisms of control at Lacknell not give you the impetus to make sure that FSG training was taking place and taking place consistently?
Well, absolutely. And the 34 actions, a large portion of which were aimed at control, were actions that we had as an organisation identified for ourselves. So I think that is an example of how seriously we had taken what had happened at Lacknell before we got anywhere near a coroner's inquest.
Can we now go to Assistant Commissioner George's review of control in July 2016? And staying in your first statement, could we go back to page 13 and paragraph 35? Thank you. we see it at the bottom of that page, and paragraph 35 you say this: between March and July 2016, I instigated a review of control in response to findings from stress workshops and staff engagement sessions. AC Tom George provided me with some detail of staff engagement sessions, and these were taken into consideration when preparing the terms of reference for the review. If we could turn over the page to page 14 and paragraph 36. You say this: the review team was led by AC Tom George. My brief was that the review should be wide-ranging, but A, not designed to deal with vision, which was being discussed in a separate ongoing work group with staff side, handed over to AC George after my retirement, and B, not designed to return to the shift system prior to 2010, which would negatively impact on the demand and supply approach and training opportunities. If, however, during the course of the review, a new shift system was proposed, which still provided the benefits of the post-2010 shift system, then it should be considered. Outside of those parameters, AC Tom George was given free rein to complete a comprehensive review and make recommendations to ensure that control was in the best possible position to deliver its functions effectively and efficiently. Now, did you consider asking him to refer back to the pre-inquest control-related actions for Lacknell to check whether they had been properly and fully completed?
No, I didn't specifically mention those. I was mindful of the issues that still remain, much of which we've discussed this morning. So I was conscious that they manifested themselves in this report. But no, I didn't sit down with Tom Jordan and say, here's this report, look at this as you're looking at this as well. No.
Did your consciousness extend to informing him about the existence of Mr. Kelly's audit of August 2010?
I don't believe I specifically mentioned that report, no, but the issues that flow from it in terms of training and training plans were in my mind, and I was keen that they were in here, and indeed they were a bullet point, I believe.
Did you refer Mr. George to the various matters highlighted in Mr. Lindridge's audits of January and November 2013?
Not the report itself, no, but any issues that still existed that flowed out of that, in my mind, made sure that they was in this report.
Did you refer him to the MOPAC audit of February 2015?
Again, I don't recall showing him that in particular. I think he would have been aware of that though, because he would have been sitting at performance management board meetings where that kind of report would have flowed back and forth. So I think he probably would have been aware of its existence.
Wouldn't it have helped Mr. George to understand the nature and duration of the problems affecting control if he'd been provided with all the various reports, audits, reviews completed since August 2010?
It would have been advantageous, yes. I think the main issue, the thread of the main issue that's come out of all of those was the issue of recording training and training plans, and that was in the forefront of my mind, and that was considered by Tom George in the review. So I accept to be completely rounded, to give him a pack of reviews would have been helpful, but the key issue about training was included in this.
There was no good reason not to provide Mr. George with those various audits and reviews, was there?
No.
Can we go to NFB 000-83873/1? Now we can see at the foot of page 1, Mr. George sent you a copy of his report on the 1st of July 2016. And if we scroll up, we can see that you replied on the 5th of July 2016. And you said this: "Thanks for all your hard work. I've made quite a few changes and comments to this, some of which are self-explanatory and others we may need to talk through. Now, staying in this document, can we go to page 9? This is where we find the draft report and your comments on it. And if I could ask you to look at paragraph 25, which is at the top of page 9, and Mr. George wrote this. Some staff feel that they are not adequately developed in role or receive development to progress to a higher role. The review has identified that maintenance of skills training is ad hoc, not planned in a robust manner, and often not recorded on individuals' training records. It could be argued that the current shift system does not support the ability for individuals to easily undertake maintenance of skills training, as there is no facility for an OM to conduct watch training or watch meetings away from the main control room in a way that station staff can do by utilising the strategic resource facility as an example. Now, as against that paragraph, you commented thus: I would completely disagree with this comment, as the facility exists, albeit local management amended it, during the day when 3 shifts are at work. We should tone it down a bit. Now, didn't that reflect exactly the issue identified in the fire service manual we looked at last week, with on-watch training and the need to maintain staff in the control room, hindering the ability to deliver training?
The manual, when it refers to staff in the control room and delivering training, is, in my opinion, talking about trying to deliver training to someone who's sitting at their workstation. The way the London Operations Centre was designed is with separate wings to the building. There's a range of units and sections that work in there quite successfully. They've got nothing to do with training. It's a purpose-built training venue, and there is a separate training control room. So I don't think the manual had the likes of the London Operations Centre in its mind. Well, indeed it didn't, because it manifests itself years after the manual was written. But I don't think it had that kind of arrangement in mind when it was saying the things it was saying.
Whilst mindful of that answer, doesn't Mr. George's observation that there was no facility for training away from the control room echo again the recommendation, the advice in the fire service manual that watch training away from the control room should be considered?
If you look at this in its purest form, quite possibly, but I would contest that training was taken away from the control room, because it was in a dedicated training facility within the footprint of the London Operations Centre, but it was away from the control room. And if you then insist that it's, not you personally, Mr. Kinnear, but if one insists that it needs to be outside of the footprint of control, then you face a range of other challenges that actually hinders good training. So I feel that a compromise was being reached, and I felt that the way Tom George's comments were phrased here, it was almost making excuses for things that actually could be done quite simply.
The fire service manual was published in '98. Was it a document that you ever had cause to consult?
No.
And why was that?
Oh, sorry. You mean me consult in terms of refreshing my own mind?
Or just having a look to see what it recommended on particular matters of operational practice management, etc.?
Sorry, I thought you meant consult in terms of its publication. No, it wasn't. It wasn't a document that I would consult. I would expect Brigade Control Management to consult that and bring to my attention if there's something in there that we are contravening.
Now, can we stay in this document but move to page 16 and look at paragraph 59, which is in the... which we see there. Now, the second half from the top of the page, AC George concluded this: one reason for a lack of regular maintenance of skills training has been the difficulty in getting the watch together, away from the control room, to undertake team-based training sessions. When the shift changed in 2011, it was proposed that such training would be carried out on the short shift. However, this has rarely been achieved for a number of reasons, including a shortage of staff, the inflexibility of breaks, and the necessity for control staff to support other functions, including RMC, RML, and NCC. Now, what was your reaction to the finding that training during the short shift had been rarely achieved?
Well, I was really disappointed because, I was disappointed on two levels. So firstly, I'd been involved years ago with control staff and the need to do something to be able to release more of them for training. So by working hard with staff side representatives to introduce a shift system that supported training, it was disappointing to see that it wasn't being used effectively. But the second reason I was disappointed is this focus on is all about the short shift. And whilst the short shift clearly supplies a lot of staff that are able to be released for training, it's not only about the short shift. So for me, it was a complete misunderstanding of what was there to utilise.
Now, Mr. George didn't mention FSG training at all. Did its absence give you cause for concern? There doesn't appear to be a comment about it. I was just wondering whether it prompted any further concerns from you.
When Tom George did this report, I knew that the command unit training was well up and running, so I knew there was fire survival guidance training of sorts going on. And I was also aware, because I think Tom had been in position for about 3 or 4 months now, so prior to him taking over, I was aware that that curve, if you like, in terms of fire survival guidance training was on the up again. So no, I wasn't overly concerned that he hadn't specifically mentioned it. I took it as read that in his broad discussions around training plan that was included in that.
And that explains the absence of any comment from you on this draft report on the
Yes.
subject of FSGs.
Yes.
Now, staying on this page, can we look at paragraph 59B, B for Bravo, where Mr. George recommended the following: use Babcock, the Brigade's training provider, to provide easily accessible CBT, computer-based training packages within Big Learning, and introduce new control-specific training when necessary, including tactical decision-making exercises. Now, you commented in the sidebar, we agreed this some time ago, what's happened since? Now, is the reference there to an agreement to the plan in 2010 for CBT to be used to deliver FSG refresher training in the alternate year programme?
Well, it's partly that, but it's also discussions I had with colleagues who were responsible for this. It's things that fell out the MOPAC report. It was work that Richard Chandler had done. So it was a combination of things. We're all pointing to this. So that comment wasn't aimed at one specific action.
Because the impression you get from the comment, what's happened since, is that you are unaware of what had been happening in this regard since 2010. What would you say to that observation?
Well, no, not since 2010. I was aware of what had been happening since 2010, but it still caught me slightly by surprise in terms of the whole issue with Big Learning and accessible CBT packages, and yet we're now in 2016. So it wasn't 2010 versus 2016. It was just going back to this journey that, where are we on this journey now?
Because this journey appears to be a somewhat prolonged exercise, because we're now 6 years on from the original proposal in respect of CBT training, and it appeared still not to be happening. Now, would you accept that 6 years evidences a chronic failing?
If you time it back from 2010, then clearly it's a position that we clearly didn't want to be in. But I wouldn't take it back to that. It was things that were improving as we went, but we still weren't getting to where we ultimately wanted to be.
With respect, Mr. Brown, it's a touch mealy-mouthed, isn't it? What we've got here is a clear recommendation that CBT be provided in 2010. It's 2016, and nothing, or at least nothing effective, seems to have happened. It's difficult to think of a starker example of a chronic failing, isn't it?
It clearly is something that no one was proud of, and obviously we look back and there's more, I guess, that could have been done at various points, but it was incremental improvements, and yes, I accept that we were off the mark in terms of where we ultimately wanted to be with the CBT package, but I wouldn't accept that nothing had been done in the interim period. It just wasn't enough.
Could we turn to LFB 000-32824? Now, this is the review of Brigade control dated February 2017, which effectively summarised Mr. George's report. Now, can you help us as to why Mr. George's report, prepared in July 2016, had not been provided to CMB or some other senior body or individuals before February 2017?
Well, it had. So firstly, when I received Tom George's report, it was in its first draft, shall we say, and I think we've just illustrated that there are a number of comments I had on it. It was also quite a long report as well. I think it was around about 30 odd pages. So I asked Tom George to do some work on it to make it more concise, and a lot of the recommendations were, whilst I agreed with all the recommendations, some of them were very minor recommendations. And so I asked him to do some more work on that, and that took a period of time. Then we took it, or Tom, at my request, took it through staff side consultation. Then it would go through a process of coming through our own governance procedures, so our own performance management board, and then prior to any report going to corporate management board, which is Brigade practice and due process, it would then also go for heads of service consultation. So there was a variety of processes it needed to go through, which was good governance, and that's the reason for the between July 16 and February 17.
Now, you are listed as the author in the top left there. Is it correct, though, that this document was drafted substantially by Mr. George?
Oh, yeah. And I don't think that suggests I'm the author. I can understand why you'd say that. It was just being presented. So, it was practice that the director would present it. But I think Tom came to CMB and presented it himself, which we would have agreed because in the next 6 weeks he was about to take my role, so it was only appropriate.
Mr. George indicated that the report was brought before CMB at the prompting of Commissioner Cotton. Does that accord with your recollection?
I think Danny Cotton might have asked if it was coming to CMB before I left, and I had absolutely no objection to it going to CMB. It was a report that was based on findings prompted by a staff survey, which was quite rightly a big issue in the Brigade at the time. So absolutely no issue with it going to corporate management board.
Could we turn to page 6 in the document? And we see the heading Progress Post Review, and underneath that paragraph 22 identified a number of improvements. And if we go to the third bullet point, which says this: additional familiarisation training to all staff on NCC and fire survival guidance. Can you remember now what had prompted an update on FSG training to be included, bearing in mind that FSG training had not been mentioned by Mr. George in the underlying report?
I think this refers to, or is a nod to, the other fire survival guidance work, and I deliberately don't use the term training because it relates to command unit exercises where staff were being involved in that triangulation of transfer of information to the fire ground.
Why are you hesitant about using the word training to describe that type of exercise?
Because I think if to be purist about it, there is a difference between an exercise and training. So whilst it is it's obviously very useful to have staff involved in exercise where they can practice their skills and trainers on hand to give them feedback, that's strictly speaking not the same as training in terms of a trainer-student relationship.
Now, had you discussed that particular point with Mr. George, hence why it was included in this summary of his views?
I don't believe so. I think one of the issues when I asked Tom to take up this role was to take responsibility for command units, and I actually wanted the same person specifically looking at command units, integration into watch-based staff and control, because that fed so perfectly into Policy Note 790.
To the lay eye, at least, that third bullet point gives the impression that additional training had been provided since July 2016. What additional training had in fact been provided, mindful of your caveat about that word?
On fire survival guidance?
Yeah.
Additional familiarisation training would refer to the fact that we had come through vision and we were carrying on with the year-on-year fire survival guidance training as planned, plus the 790. It's only me being overly pedantic in terms of training and PN 790. So there was certainly much more interaction between control staff and the whole fire survival guidance ethos at this moment in time than there had been previously.
The reason I ask is, just looking at the word additional, it's not immediately clear what additional training had been provided. Are you able to assist us on the substance of what additional training is referred to here?
I think additional refers to the cumulative effect of the reference information files being far more specific to fire survival guidance, the fact that fire survival guidance reference information forms were used after every fire survival guidance call, the fact that we were doing Policy Note 790 training, that we'd got back to close where we wanted to be on the Lacanau House year-on-year fire survival guidance training. So technically you could say, well, what's additional in all of that? But I think it was meant to encompass everything that was going on.
Just one final question before lunch. Could I ask you to go to LFB 000555191/26? You'll recall this is the table in Mr. Hayward's statement below paragraph 74. And if that table could be expanded, we can see that only 46% of staff had received some FSG training in 2016 and only 32% in 2017. Now, mindful of those statistics, can we go further into his statement to paragraph 78.4, which can be found at page 29? That's at the very bottom of the page. We see that Mr. Hayward, in evidence, said this: in 2017, up to the date of the Grenfell Tower fire, no refresher FSG training had taken place. Now, mindful of those statistics, what was the source of the information that was presented to the Corporate Management Board about additional FSG training?
Well, it would have referred to the Policy Note 790 exercise that was going on. It would have referred to I believe that there was fire survival guidance training as specified continuing. It's just the issue about the level of recording that was a severe problem and challenge for us. I don't agree with that no fire survival guidance professional training had taken place, because in my conversations with Scott, 2015 was the crunch year because of vision, and then in early 2016, and then this graphical curve started to pick up again. So that is not my recollection of the way things were.
Would you accept, though, that Mr. Hayward was best placed to speak directly as to what training had been provided, given the immediacy of his control?
Yes, I can't argue with that point. But what I can say is that if that's true in 78.4, then that certainly wasn't brought to my attention, and that's not my understanding of things as a result of discussions with Scott.
Mr. Brown, thank you.
That's a good point, isn't it?
Good point, sir. Thank you.
Yes, well, Mr. Brown, we'll stop there so we can all have some lunch. We'll come back at 2 o'clock, please. And again, please don't discuss your evidence with anyone when they're out of the room.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Right. Thank you. 2 o'clock, please.
Thanks, sir.